Alright, so in this video I'm going to provide a broad overview of the major divisions of philosophy and the questions that those major divisions pursue. So, philosophy, like science, has subdisciplines. Science, for example, has biology, chemistry, engineering, physics, and so on. Philosophy has these five right here. Now, if you're an experienced philosophy student, you might see that there are some branches that you wish were here that aren't. And the reason for that is that philosophy is a wide and varied topic, and there's an immense amount of discussion about what ought to be considered philosophy or what ought to be considered under one of these categories or not. So, just know that this model that I'm providing is not meant to be exhaustive, nor is it meant to be an inclusive perspective that takes together everything everyone's saying about philosophy. Rather, this is just the standard model taught in a number of colleges and university systems. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the meat of it. So, up here we have five major disciplines within philosophy. We have metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Now, for each of these, I'm going to give an overview of what they are, an example of some questions that they would deal with, and then philosophers that have been important in their development or have contributed to their discipline. So, metaphysics is the one that we're going to start with. So, metaphysics deals with existence. Now, I qualify that by saying this. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a wonderful resource, by the way, if you're learning. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, its entry on metaphysics, the very first sentence that it says is, metaphysics is a very hard word to define. But with that out of the way, for us we're just going to say that metaphysics, for now, is the study of existence. Metaphysics concerns itself with questions like, what is real? Or, another big one that comes up a lot, is there a God? What kind of God is that? So, metaphysics deals with the largest questions of what's in the universe and what isn't. What's the difference between real and not real, and why is that difference meaningful? So, an important thinker in metaphysics, and pretty much every philosopher has had something important to say about metaphysics, but one that I'm going to talk about is Plato. Plato is probably the most famous philosopher, and Plato was active in the 4th century BC. He was a student of Socrates, and he lived in Athens. Plato had a lot to say, but on the topic of metaphysics, one of his biggest ideas is that all of the objects that we see around us in what we would call the real world, this computer, some books that I'm looking at, credit cards, are just shadowy reflections of idealized forms that exist in another universe. They have their inherent properties because they borrow them from objects that exist perfectly in a different universe. So, this is an example of metaphysics, trying to make sense of what's in the world around us using logic and reasoning. So, let's talk about this next one in green. Now, of the 5 words up here, this one's probably causing the most stress for first-time viewers. Epistemology is a really big fancy word that means the study of knowledge. Epistemology deals with what do we know, how do we know it, and why is that knowledge meaningful? So, one big question that epistemology would consider is whether something is logical or not. Whether something is logical or not. Does something make sense? Or can you prove, using reasoning, a certain point? So, epistemology is really a very, very important topic within philosophy, because all of the other discussions about metaphysics or aesthetics or political philosophy all depend on this for their intellectual validity, for their proof, for their truth value. So this deals with knowledge and truth and how we know the difference between truth and falsehood. So one thing I forgot to mention back here, metaphysics is extremely important because it gives you the basics of your philosophical worldview. It gives you the foundation for understanding all of these other things. And it's for that reason that Aristotle, the philosopher who was the student of Plato actually, called metaphysics first philosophy. And I'll do my best to write that out. First philosophy. And Aristotle didn't mean that this is the philosophy that you go and learn first, but rather this is the branch of philosophy upon which all of the other branches are dependent. So that's why he gave it that name. So moving back to epistemology, an example of a question that epistemology would deal with, if I haven't already given one, is if the entire universe, if all of the objects in the universe were simultaneously expanding, and the spaces between them were expanding too, would we have any way of knowing that? Interesting to think about. I encourage you to give that some thought. So, moving on to ethics, this is a word that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, because this deals with the difference between right and wrong. This is a group of theoretical assumptions or theoretical arguments about what kinds of personal actions are going to maximize human flourishing or increase human happiness, or whatever their desired good is. So ethics is about morality. It's about value theory, asking the question of what matters and what doesn't. And ethics also deals with happiness. What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be evil? And so on. So a common example of ethics is the trolley car problem. The trolley car problem says that a train is out of control on the tracks, and it's heading toward a fork in the road. On one side of the fork is 5 people that'll be hit by this train and killed. On the other side is 1 person. And you have the option to pull a lever. If you do nothing, the train will mow down 5 people, and if you pull the lever, the train will divert and kill that 1 person. What is the ethical thing to do? So, problems like this fall under the purview of ethics, and ethics, like philosophy itself, has subdivisions. Utilitarianism, categorical reasoning, existential reasoning, and so on. We're not going to get into that, but this is a very, very important part of how philosophy blends with everyday life, how it goes from theoretical to practical. So, in that similar vein, we have our next topic of interest, which is politics. So, politics deals with the question of how should society be ordered and who should be in charge and why. So, when we're arguing about who our prime minister should be, or we're arguing about whether or not a law is just, we're drawing on themes that come up in political philosophy. So, very famous philosophers in this field are John Locke, you may have heard of him from history class, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who formalized the idea of the social contract. And these kinds of things come up anytime we're trying to make decisions that relate to society as a whole. How should we be good citizens? Or what kind of society should we live in? Capitalist society, communist society, or something in the middle? Should we live under an authoritarian government that uses surveillance to try and prevent citizens from doing things they ought not to do? Or should we live in a more limited government that has less surveillance, but perhaps more opportunity for crime? These kinds of discussions fall under the branch of politics or political philosophy. Lastly, over here we have aesthetics, which is the study of what is beautiful, or the study of art. So, beauty and art. Now, it might surprise you that philosophers actually have a lot to say about this, but this is one of the hot topics in continental philosophy especially. Questions of, does this particular artifact deserve to be considered art, or is it just another object? Like, that's a big one, and that's one people actually discuss a lot. For example, Andy Warhol's soup cans. Art, not art. Questions like these drive the aesthetic philosopher into probing the nature of what is beautiful and what deserves to be held up as a cultural artifact, as art. So, with this, I hope I've given you a bird's eye view of how philosophy works, how it's divided, and the kinds of big questions that philosophers think about. Hopefully, for some of you, this has clarified what philosophers do and how they do it.